My name is Bobby Tanzilo, and I am the senior editor and writer at OnMilwaukee.com, which is a daily online city magazine. And I write mostly about history and architecture and sort of other stuff, beer, whiskey, a little bit of everything. Worked at the Sentinel for about 4 years after I graduated, and did all kinds of stuff there. I was in the sports department technically, but I wrote about history. I did a couple movie reviews, tons of music stuff, some book reviews, things like that. But it didn't seem to be going anywhere. I couldn't really get like a full-time permanent position there, so that's when I ended up going to work at Schwartz Bookshop. The independent bookstore was not really a long-term success plan anymore. And I had gotten a message from OnMilwaukee when I was about a year old asking if the bookstore wanted to advertise. And then one of the owners sent me an email saying, do you know anybody who wants to come work as like an editor or a writer? And I said, well, I'll let you know if I think of somebody. And I went on a trip to Italy, and when I was coming back, I thought, I don't want to go back to work. I mean, I love the job, I love the people, but like, you know, sometimes you just reach a point where you're just ready to move on. When I came back, he emailed again, and I said, yeah, no, I don't know anybody. And then I thought, oh, wait, me? And so I thought, you know, this was 2000, and at the time, I mean, the internet had been around for a while, but the idea of an internet magazine seemed a little iffy. And I thought, well, you know what, I'll do it. And if nothing else, it forces me to choose to do something else, right? If it happens for 2 years, I'll then be forced to make a move, you know. So I took the job, and now 25 years later, I'm still at OnMilwaukee, and Schwartz Bookshop hasn't existed for years, which seemed impossible at the time to believe, but I guess it turned out to be the right move. Ooh, it's been a roller coaster ride, because it's been, you know, when I started, I was the first person they hired, but when I got to the office, it was basically just me, the 3 owners, and these 2 programmers, and we just sort of did whatever we wanted. It was just sort of, you know, I like to say that my wife called on my first day and said, how's it going? I said, well, my boss just walked by eating a donut and kicking a beach ball in bare feet. It was sort of like a Simpsons episode in a way, I guess. But it's really changed I mean, now it's a considerably more professional operation. But there were a lot of years where I felt like it was being in a band, you know, like you had that sort of camaraderie, and you had to be really scrappy, and you had to kind of like, you know, sort of fight for everything. And now it's a little more traditional at this point. So it's really gone through a lot of phases, and I've somehow managed to roll with those. I don't know how, but. Well, you know, I mean, urban spelunking is a term that has existed for a long time, and a lot of people use it to describe the sorts of dangerous and illegal things I can't really do because the dangerous part, because I'm a father and I feel a need to be here for my children. But also, if I were to be breaking into places illegally, I couldn't really then go to work and write about it. So, I mean, a lot of these places are shut to the public for a reason. A lot of them are really dangerous. A lot of time, I mean, I even go into places with people and I'm allowed to go that are occasionally dangerous. And, you know, sometimes you really got to test a step before you put your full weight on it. If you get hurt, you can't sue anybody because you didn't belong there in the first place. And you're the one who's injured or dead in the end, right? It started out as I got invited to do a bunch of sort of treks, like climb to the top of the dome at St. Josaphat Basilica, to climb to the top of the wings of the art museum. There's a staircase that goes up the middle. To go to the very top of City Hall. You know, you can usually go up to the bells with the tour, but we got to go all the way up to the very top. So the term kind of got coined from doing that, but then it's sort of morphed into more just kind of like hyper-local history of the city, sort of through buildings, but usually the buildings are just an excuse to talk about people. And at that point, there was really no intention to make it a series, but it just sort of ended up spiraling that way. You know, people saw one and they said, oh, you should come see this. Then somebody said, oh, you should come see that. And there are people who will pitch me urban spelunking story ideas that are clearly not urban spelunking story ideas. They just want the promotion from it. So I do try and keep it to the hyper-local history of buildings, preferably behind the scenes stuff, but again, it can really vary. I really love going into churches because they have the best like attics and towers and things. I'm a big fan of climbing towers and those sorts of things. And so yeah, there's some really great ones. One of the first ones was going up to St. Josaphat, the top of the Basilica, St. Josaphat on Lincoln Avenue, and the lantern at the top, which is that very bit at the very top. And to get up there, you have to go up to the attic of the church, and then you have to climb like a vertical wooden ladder that was built by the guys who built the church, just hammered the ladder together up there. And then you have to like sort of crawl on a ladder that's like follows the slope of the dome. And then you get to the top of that, and there's a big opening, circular opening, that looks straight down to the floor of the church. And it's got to be 75 feet down, and it's terrifying because it's open. There's no railing, people are not supposed to really go up there. But then from that, you have to then take like another ladder and staircase to get up into that lantern. But then once you're up there, you just have the best view of everything. And then you also have the terrifying thought of going back down. I have to say, going up is always a lot easier than going down. But also really any of the big churches in town, like Trinity, which had the fire a few years ago, any of those churches that size, when you go up to the towers, you're climbing like vertical ladders often that were built 150 years ago. And again, the going up's a lot better than the going down. But yeah, so I love buildings like that. And I've visited all the landmarks, which are nice. I love going up to the top of the Calatrava edition of the Art Museum where the wings are. There's a ladder sort of that goes up the middle so that they can tend to all the gears that handle each one of the little fins. And when you get up to the top of that, you sort of have to, again, you have to kind of climb it almost on all fours. And you get to the top and you're looking out at the lake, so there's really not much to see. But then you turn around and you're up there and you can see the museum sort of like a giant slide below you. And the skyline right there, it's incredible, yeah. I have one that I like to talk about that I always, that does not exist anymore. It was I feel like it really kind of sums up these stories because it was this just sort of a plain, sort of orangey red brick building at the intersection of two alleys just north of the Bradley Center. And for years I would walk past it and think, this looks like a really interesting building. It's either got a really great story or it's got no story whatsoever because it had, all the windows were boarded up, 2 stories, just like it didn't look like anything was going on there. Turned out that the Bradley Center folks used it as storage and called it the North Building. And they let me go in, finally, once they were going to tear down the Bradley Center. They didn't want to let me in before that because they were afraid people would break in and steal stuff. So I went in there, and upstairs, like on the lower level, it just was a bunch of open spaces, and then upstairs was clearly an old apartment. There's a kitchen, there's rooms with peeling paint and everything. And one of the doors, it had like a door that looked like a hayloft door. And on the inside, it had a Usinger's elf sticker on it. So I called Fritz Usinger at Usinger's and I said, I found the sticker in there. Do you know what's up with this building? And it turned out that this building was built as a stables for Usinger's when they used to deliver their sausage to stores with a horse-drawn wagon. And then when cars came in trucks, they started using it as a garage. And they let one of their salesmen named Art live in the apartment that was in this place. And he raised a family in this place. So they always called it Art's Garage. And Fritz said, Art's son is like 95 and still operates one of the Bradley Center parking lots. So you should go talk to him. So I went and talked to him. He invited me to his house. He had tons of pictures of the place. He had literally grown up in this place. And he had pictures of him when it had like a white picket fence around it. And it's like him and his little dog playing out in the yard, sitting out in the yard. And he was telling me about the neighborhood where there was a grocery store next door, and then there was this other store over there, and then he went to school at a school that was no longer there across the street. And really just through this one kind of dilapidated looking building came this really great story about a local institution like Usinger's, this family that lived there, this guy who grew up there, and about this whole neighborhood that once existed around this place that was no longer there. And to me, that's sort of what I love about these stories, is that like people see this building all the time, maybe wouldn't look twice, but there's just all kinds of like great, interesting history about the place from like at every level, right? A personal level, a family level, a neighborhood level, a city level. And so that was always one of my favorites. Sadly, it does not exist anymore because it is now sitting underneath the Pfizer form. But it's amazing what's out there if you go looking for it. Like I'll do a story and somebody will be like, how did you find all this stuff? And I don't want to say it because it sounds snarky, but I looked. Do you know what I mean? Like there's so many stories I read about things where people will be like, just sort of throw out a fact that they sort of regurgitated from some other thing that's become sort of what the accepted version of a story, and because nobody actually goes and checks, you know? And I think that's kind of the important bit, right? It's going and checking, you know, and there are all sorts of, there's the green collection, there's the AGS collection, there's, you know, the public library has an architectural archive that has all kinds of stuff in it, like the city has a municipal archive that has all kinds of stuff in it. If you go looking for some of the stuff, you'll be surprised what you can find, you know, and sometimes it's disappointing and frustrating. You can't find everything you want to find, but really what I'm often saying to myself when people say, how did you find all this, is I looked. I moved here right after high school because my mom was from here, so we moved here. And I started at MATC because I wanted to do like sound engineering, like a recording studio, be a recording engineer. Closest thing I could find was doing their television production program. And so I started that, but I didn't like it. There's too much math. Nobody told me there would be that much math. So I ended up leaving that and coming to UWM. And I just sort of wandered for a little while. I just sort of would look and be like, oh, that looks interesting. And I would take classes just based on what looked interesting, which is not a recommended way to get out of school in 4 years, I will tell you that. But then in October of 1986, I started writing for the UWM Post, writing music stuff for the Post. And that led to me freelancing for the Shepherd Express, which might have still been called the Shepherd at the time, probably that year or early the next year. And so then I thought, well, maybe I'll do this journalism thing. So then I became a mass comm major at the time. I don't know what it's like now, but at the time you did mass comm and you either did print or broadcast. And you had to have a specialization in another subject. So for me, that was history. So I took a lot of history classes. And not long after I started taking those classes, those mass comm classes, I got one of my teachers and the advisor there, Kay McGowan, got me an internship with the Brewers, which was great. And I think she also is the one who got me a part-time sports clerk job at the Sentinel. So then I was pretty much into it because I mean, I wasn't a big sports guy, but I took these jobs because it was, you know, before I graduated college, I had a job at a daily morning newspaper, which was pretty amazing. So yeah, I did that. And then like I said, I took a bunch of history classes so that I could have this history kind of, it wasn't technically a minor, but it's like a specialization. And then when I graduated, I kept coming back and taking Italian classes, which I did for a few years. I had a good time at UWM. You know, it was kind of a happening place at the time. I mean, there were lots of concerts on campus and there were tons of concerts in the ballroom. Yeah, so it was a fun place to go to school. I probably should have worked harder, but I was, you know, those first few years, like I said, I was just kind of wandering around trying to figure out what to do, you know, and I had definite ideas of what I was interested in, but I was having trouble kind of finding a way to translate that into actual coursework, you know, like I would skip classes, but I wouldn't skip classes to like, you know, go smoke or something. I'd skip classes and come here to the library and read about stuff I was interested in that I wasn't getting in classes. So I had to sort of figure out how to marry those things, my interests with what was here. And mass comm is what did that for me, really. It helped me sort of find an outlet for the things I was interested in and the ability to kind of like dig into the things I was interested in. And when I was here, I mean, I graduated in '89, so there was no social media yet. There was no internet. There was That's why there was print or broadcast, because you were either going to work in a newspaper or a magazine, or you wanted to be on the TV news or the radio or whatever, you know. I spent probably most of my time in the Union and here, the library, when I wasn't in class, you know. But when I was in class, I was always in Johnston or Holton, because all the history stuff was in Holton. And then all the journalism stuff was pretty much in Johnston, and some of them were in Merrill. So yeah, I was there a lot for classes. And then here a lot in the library to do work, and the Union to eat and just kind of hang out and, you know. The green story was one I'd always been interested in doing. I just, for some reason, never got around to it or had any luck making it happen. But I was really interested in the building because I was, like you, I was a mass comm major, and so I spent a lot of time in Johnston Hall and those places. And you would see it all the time, and it just looked so mysterious, like a little sort of bunker kind of building. And the collection was still in there at the time when I was here, but I never went in there and saw it, which I regret. But it's a really interesting little building that was designed by Alexander Eschweiler, who was a well-known Milwaukee architect who designed a bunch of those buildings in that old quad there, like Johnston Hall, those buildings. And it was built specifically to house this collection, which has like nearly 80,000 fossils and rocks and things. And so Thomas Green was this guy who had come to Milwaukee from Rhode Island and started a pharmaceutical business with this guy named Henry Button. And they became rich off of this. They made a ton of money. And so Thomas Green, who was a just sort of amateur geologist and into this kind of stuff, used his money to amass this incredible collection of all these things. And I think it might be by far the largest collection of Silurian fossils in the world, which is pretty amazing. So anyway, when he died, when he and his wife died, his daughter gave money to build Green Hall, which is a sort of church-like building between Johnston Hall and the museum building. And then about 10 years later, she built that museum. She basically gave the collection to the school, to Downer College, and the money to build the museum. And so it was in there for 100 or so years, maybe not quite 100 years. Again, a really interesting story. This is sort of like small bunker-like building, but it leads you to the story of Thomas Green, leads you to the story of the fact that there's this incredible collection on the campus, connected to one of the best-known architects in Milwaukee. And if you want to go back millions of years, to the fact that we live in near a Silurian reef, which is in Wauwatosa. Oh yeah, I mean, I think Milwaukee does a pretty good job. I mean, there was a time when Milwaukee was like most American cities, and there was this sort of push to remake cities in the middle of the 20th century in the name of urban renewal, and they would sort of clear, slum clearance, and what that always meant was sort of tearing down the old and building the new. And they were always, even if they didn't really have the idea of what to build new or the money to build new, they were still happy to tear down the old in the meantime, which left most of our cities with a whole lot of surface parking lots in their downtowns, which now that cities have started to come back has changed a bit. Like, when I got to Milwaukee, there were a lot of surface parking lots, more buildings came down in the 80s. And then after that, the trajectory started going the other way, and people got better about preserving what was here and seeing the value in the old buildings. Like, you didn't have to tear it down and replace it with something new, you could fix it up. They'd say the greenest building is the one that already exists, right? So you could take a building that was already there, has a history, has beauty, is still functional, and put the money into fixing that up. So I think that's really changed. We have a good historic preservation commission. Some neighborhoods like the Third Ward have their own architectural review boards, which kind of helps keep a lot of this stuff alive, which is good. And I think really the mindset has changed. I would come across these articles from the 50s and 60s where city officials would say, well, we're just going to tear that whole block down and put it in parking until we figure out what to do. And I don't think that's really the mindset anymore. I mean, I think they'll tear down what has to be torn down because it's dangerous or whatever. And I like to think that in some small way that what I'm doing is reminding people that I like to say every building has a story, because now that I've done about 500 or 600 of these stories by now, I've never struggled to find a story in a building. But now when you tear down a building, you often let like Habitat for Humanity Restore come in and strip what they want out of it so that it'll get reused, or they're, when they reuse, and back then they reused brick, but like now they'll recycle all the steel, they'll recycle, all that kind of stuff, which I think back then didn't happen. I think they just pulled a bunch of dumpsters up and tossed it all in, which is a shame.
I guess my last question is, how can we ethically explore these historic places while like respecting their history?
Well, I think exploring them really, as long as you treat it the way you know what I mean, like you respect it in a physical way, like you don't take things from the buildings, you don't damage anything, you don't, like that sort of thing. I think really just the act of visiting them and sharing their stories is respecting their history, right? It's like, I often think about, for some of my stories, I gather a lot of detail, and often I'm trying to decide, do I put this in? Is it interesting? Is it not interesting? And then sometimes, like if I'm on the edge, I always just think about, I'm sort of moving the ball down the field in some of it, in some way, like hopefully somebody will come back in a few years and rewrite a better version of this story. I don't think the ones I write are the be all and end all, but I like to put as much as I can in there for the next person, so to speak, because I'm hoping that there will be more people doing this, I'm thrilled that you guys are doing this, because you're the next generation of people who can do this. And then hopefully there'll be a generation after you who will want to do it. And I'm hoping to just kind of dig up what I can so that it's there for the next guy, right? And I think doing that is respecting the buildings and their history, because it's helping to keep them alive.